Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar today. My name is Robert Driver, and I'm the Marketing Manager for IfM Engage here at the Institute for Manufacturing. So just firstly, welcome to this webinar using SWOT road mapping for enhanced analysis and planning. It's obviously a topic that's of real interest to the community, as we've had lots of registrations from across the world, over 300 people registering to hear from our experts today. So thank you for taking the time to attend. Before we get started, I just wanted to go through a bit of housekeeping. Firstly, we're recording the session today, and we'll send it out to everybody that has registered, and that will come after this session. Please use the Q&A functionality within the webinar to pose questions for our speakers to answer at a question and answer session at the end of this session. And finally, you can use the chat functionality if you have any technical questions, and we'll do our best to answer them and help. So just moving on to a bit about the IfM. The Institute for Manufacturing is part of the University of Cambridge's Department of Engineering. We conduct research across a broad range of manufacturing-related topics under three main strands: management, technology, and policy. We also support students through education programs, providing both undergraduate and postgraduate education programs. And finally, we work with all sorts of organisations across industry, government, and universities, through our practice arm, IfM Engage, applying tools through consultancy, courses, and memberships. So just to introduce our speakers, Dr. Rob Phaal, who is an expert in road mapping, has been conducting research in this area for decades. So delighted to have Rob presenting today, and Imoh Ilevbare, who is a principal specialist with IfM Engage, working with organisations across the world to transfer road mapping expertise through courses and consultancy, and Dr. Yuta Hirose, who is also an expert with IfM Engage, who works very similarly to Imoh, again transferring road mapping through consultancy as well. So I'll hand over to Rob now to start the main content of the presentation.
Thank you, and hello. Here's the schedule for this webinar. I'll be providing an overview of SWOT and road mapping, and also how we've, in principle, connected the two methods. And then two case studies from my colleagues, Imoh and Yuta, on the application of this approach, with some time for Q&A. So, what is SWOT? Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. It's, I think, without doubt, the most widely used strategy framework, although it's often used in a rather shallow way. So a typical SWOT analysis might look something like this, where you've got a list of the external strengths and weaknesses, internal strengths and weaknesses, and external opportunities and threats. And I'm not criticizing this example at all. It's very typical and good practice in a sort of workshop environment where these factors are identified. But often people are left a little bit confused about what to make of this data. And so, although SWOT has emerged more than 50 years ago in the 1960s, it propagates at a slightly shallow level most typically. But there are more sophisticated approaches to SWOT, freely available for many years. The one I find most interesting is this paper called TOWS. I think people often think it's a totally different method. It's really just the sequencing of the operations that is emphasized here. But in this paper from 1982 from Heinz Weyrich from California, he really positions SWOT at the heart of strategy. So you can see the little diagram on the right is a strategy process. And very interestingly, on the bottom right there, has provided a technique for systematically relating the external internal factors. And that's the bit that we've really taken on board. In terms of SWOT versus TOWS, the sequence of operations does matter. SWOT really is emphasizes a technology or resource push logic. You're starting with your internal resources. The trouble with that is if you have a strength or weakness, with respect to what? You need to really have some sort of vision or context in order to make those judgments. So the TOWS sequence is more of a sort of market or demand side pull logic, where you start first with those external drivers and then you consider your strengths and weaknesses. My preference, I think any order is okay, but my preference really is to start with the positive. So my default would be opportunities, threats, and then strengths and weaknesses. OTSWA, which isn't such a nice acronym, but I think makes more sense. Okay, and one final thing is that where's the time dimension in SWOT? This really puzzles me, because if you pick up a book on strategy, there's time is often very intangible. And so, which is strange for strategy, which is fundamentally time-based. So in the TOWS matrix, Professor Weirich basically suggests repeating the process multiple times for each time frame, that we think we can do it more efficiently by bringing in road mapping. So what is road mapping? Well, it's a structured visualization of strategic information and strategic plans. It's basically provides a sort of a structured canvas around which you can organize all strategic information. The little sketch here illustrates 3 very common perspectives as layers, and you can customize those to make visible any relevant perspective in your strategic situation to any level of granularity. So often you have a multi-layered structure set against time, and within that framework, it's very holistic. It's the only tool really that shows the big picture. It's the picture on the front of the jigsaw puzzle box. And I've just picked this sketch because often roadmaps get quite polished for communication, and it's very hard to see what led up to that diagram. And that's where a lot of the value lies, is using the structure to organize the important conversations you need to have between all the stakeholders, and to decide what to do next, the decisions and issues that support it. And eventually you'll get a coherent view, and then you can develop a nice diagram to communicate more widely. Many ways to organize road mapping. You can be very quantitative and analytical. And at the other extreme, you can really focus on the communication and conversations you need to have. And we've tended to focus on that, to bring these structures into a multidisciplinary, multifunctional workshop environment, to organize those conversations, to build communication and consensus about the state of knowledge and what to do next. So this particular photograph is from a very commonly applied process we work with, very flexible, called S-Plan. We applied at the sector level, corporate level, or any sector you like. We understand how to adapt it. The reference process is a one-day workshop, which can be quite large scale, about 30 people in this room from this photograph. And the idea is really to iterate really fast. That's why we call it fast start. It's an agile approach. And the first iteration is really to establish exactly what you know and what you don't know and what to do next. Eventually, the complete roadmap is downstream from this. And I've just highlighted in this photograph 3 key steps in S-Plan workshop, because this is where we've integrated SWOT into. So number 1 there is a very large chart on the wall. We call it landscape. And the idea of that is to collect all of the relevant information, either before the workshop or during the workshop, from all of the people who are in the room. And we've thought very carefully who to invite to represent all the perspectives. Number 2 there is a portfolio selection or prioritization tool, where from the landscape, we're trying to identify interesting opportunities that we might wish to pursue. And we need to prioritize those where we spend our time. And number 3 there is, this is when the photograph was taken, is a small group activity in the afternoon, a multifunctional group working on one of those topics to establish an exploratory roadmap. And then after that, people are usually pretty comfortable as to how they should take that forward if they want to. Thanks, Imoh. So how did we relate these two methods? We did link SWOT into SPLAN because it's our standard reference point, but we don't claim that this is the only way to integrate the methods. And even within this framework, we think there are lots of degrees of freedom and adaptations you can make. But basically what we've done is we've combined three general tools together. Firstly, this the Weyrich sort of linking grids to help us establish in a very traceable way the relationships between the external opportunities and threats and the internal strengths and weaknesses. And then road mapping brings a more systems perspective, including all of the relevant perspectives on your strategic situation, and very importantly, the time dimension. And so we can, through the introduction of road mapping, bring time in right from the bottom, or from the beginning. And then finally, the class of sort of classic consulting 2x2 matrices, we're using adapted versions of the ones we know well to prioritize the various parts of the process. So here in a sort of a schematic way is the overall process. And I've coded in those three elements from the photograph in the previous slide. So what we have at the first, we're starting with this landscape, this really large chart, and we're working at the top layer first, which is the external trends and drivers. And we're thinking about what are those today and in the medium term and in the long term. And we prioritize those to understand which are the most important ones for our organization. Then we move to the bottom and think about what are our current strengths and weaknesses with respect to those future trends and drivers. So right from the start, we've got the time dimension into the discussion. And we prioritize those using another 2x2 matrix. And then we bring in these linking grids where we systematically can relate the most important trends and drivers to the most important strengths and weaknesses. And the really nice thing about that is it gives you a really balanced and traceable sort of injection into the middle of the roadmap, if you like, of strategic options that we could pursue, or perhaps we don't want to pursue. And that's really where the quality enhancement to road mapping comes, is a really good way of combining the push and the pull into the practical things we might do. And that's why SWOT is really at the heart of all strategy processes, even if it's more implicit than it should be. And I think why this integration has been a little bit more kind of invasive than many integrations with road mapping, which is more of a bolt-on, because it does lie at the heart of strategy. And then once we have these strategic options, which are balanced in the sense that we're looking at both the positive and negative sides of the top and bottom layers, we then go to step 3, which are these small group activities to actually flesh out what those options look like. And then we can make judgments about which we really want to take forward and how to integrate them together to create a portfolio roadmap. So last couple of points. Firstly, the 3 tools we're using here, we know very well, and they form the components of an underlying framework we have, which is a scalable toolkit platform construct, which is a very flexible starting point for almost any strategic problem. And you can adapt it and add other tools as you wish. So it's kind of comforting to see the same tools that we've worked with commonly be useful in this context. And the final point is just that these principles can be deployed in really any format of strategic planning, be it very analytical or very sort of human-centric. So I'll just represent that a little bit as a sort of digital analog dimension. And the case studies we're going to be talking about are more in the sort of analog domain, paper, post-it notes, pens, and people. But these ideas can be definitely deployed into a digital, fully digital format. And in fact, some of these principles were sort of fleshed out through that process of the challenge of coding, really. So I've been working with a colleague, Alexis Mather, who has a software systemology. And through deployment of that, we managed to establish, I think, a lot of clear principles that we could then deploy in workshops as well. Thank you. That's it for me. I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Yuta Hirose, for the first case study.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to share some insights from a case study that I was involved in Japan, applying the SWOT-based role mapping approach in the logistics and transportation industry in Japan. So in my talk, let me introduce the background happening in Japan for this industry first, and then I will explain the project design and how the approach was implemented over 12 weeks. So a few years ago, Japan Broadcasting Corporation published an article online about Japan's logistics crisis that we may face by 2030. The diagram and the image are from the corporation's website, and it's easy to find, so you are welcome to read that article as it's written in English. According to this article, about 36% gap is expected between the demand for delivery and the size of logistics labor force by 2030. Japan is the third largest economy by GDP and lots of leading companies expanding. On the other hand, Japan faces the aging of the population and workforce has been decreasing continuously in various sectors. In the logistics and transportation industry in Japan, there are other issues such as low costs of delivery, and the demand for delivery has been increasing. One reason for the demand increase is, for example, COVID. Everyone mostly stayed at home, and the frequency of online shopping has significantly increased since then, like what also happened in other countries, I believe. And also the emergence of e-commerce is one of the reasons too. So in short, as you can see, the diagram on the previous slide, the diagram on the right, logistics demand is increasing while transport capacity is decreasing as we go. So that is a big problem for the logistics and transportation industry in Japan. Next slide, please. So at the same time, there's a variety of technologies emerging around the world for improving the efficiency and effectiveness of logistics, what we call smart logistics, through the use of AI, IoT, and robotics. These images are just for visual purposes that I found from Pixabay, but such as robotic arm, automated trolley in warehouse, drone delivery, and logistical network through IoT. Next page, please. So what I'm going to share with you today is a case study with a large enterprise with engineering capabilities doing businesses in the logistics and transportation industry. The image on the right is nothing to do with the company. It's just an image from Pixabay for logistics and transportation industry. So the challenges this company facing are the first point. So as we saw the previous slide about new technologies emerging, and those are demanded in this industry to overcome some of the issues such as lack of workforce and tackle the low-cost delivery issue for efficiency and effectiveness improvement. The second point, the government of Japan is promoting what we call physical internet. It's a term emerging for the industry to aim to reduce environmental footprint while improving agility, robustness, and resilience to overcome the logistic crisis that we may face by 2030, as I introduced at the beginning of my talk. The last point, on the supply side, there are emerging technology development in AI, IoT, and robotics. On the demand side, the trend for physical internet emerging. So it is very difficult to see what are opportunities and what could be threats for this company because of the increased complexity, if you may, I want to say, as a whole. So what this company can do and may be able to do internally, and how this company can aim for further business and technology development, these are quite uncertain and challenging to navigate the future. So we were honored to come into a collaboration with this company and had the opportunity to work together to develop a technology strategy for logistics and transportation industry. So because of the increased complexity in this industry, we wanted to capture opportunities and threats while understanding the company's strengths and weaknesses so that the company could develop an informed technology strategy. Next page, please. So the project design was 12-week project running together with the company's engineers. We set an interim report in week 6 and final report in week 12. We had 90 participants, 1 team leader, 3 senior advisors, and 15 engineers from junior, mid, and senior role. With outcomes, after SWOT-based role mapping, we produced 41 options and turning them into 6 overall directions through prioritization. I'm going to show you a visual overview in the next slide, but each overall direction was visualized in technology roadmap form as well. Some of the roadmaps were put together to develop integrated visions, and we had 3 of them. Next page, please. So what we did in the first 6 weeks was based on pre-work. The company prepared market research output by using the generic pest analysis. For the first 2 weeks, each participant was developing ideas for new business and technology development. For week 3 and 4, teamwork was carried out to give feedback to each other's ideas. And then the developed ideas were linked with trends and drivers in terms of opportunity and threat, and technological resources and capabilities are linked with strengths and weaknesses. For week 5 and week 6, these were discussed among the participants to turn into overall direction for short-term, mid-term, and long-term up to 2035. Next page, please. So this is how the visual overview looks like for the first 6 weeks, from week 1 to week 6. With the idea generation, we used why, what, how, and timeline mapping, together with summary writing and diagram and image for visual communication between the participants. After identifying the ideas linking to opportunities, threats, strengths, and weakness, the SWOT-based role mapping approach in principle guides you to do assessment in terms of impact, likelihood, importance, and performance for prioritization purposes. Please click once so that animation comes up. Thank you. So however, because this company wanted to keep all the ideas at this stage, we did not only rely on prioritization through assessment, but we discussed each ideas and turned into overall direction as possible options altogether. So there were 41 ideas. We turned them into 6 overall directions. So on average, 7 to 8 options were allocated per overall direction in terms of short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Next page, please. Then for the last 6 weeks, what we did as the first step was to prioritize ideas for each of the overall directions. As at this stage, each overall directions have a range of options that could be used for strategy, but not narrowed down yet. So we narrowed down the options as if we are developing a storyline from now to 2035 as to how this company could develop technology and businesses in the logistics and transportation industry. That was week 7. For week 8 and week 9, there were 4 teams. 2 teams look at 1 overall direction each, and the other 2 teams look at 2 overall directions each. So that's 6 overall directions in total. Then each team did a case analysis and roadmap development for further investigation. The dimensions for case study was suggested by the company's executive, and it was helpful. So each team could work on them accordingly. For week 10 for week 10, to enrich the case analysis and roadmap development in terms of quality of the outputs, we did an evaluation session. 1 person from each team explained their results to other team members to get feedback. We did this process twice with different teams. For week 11 and 12, before finishing up this project, we had looked around all the results, including cases and roadmaps, and we discussed to put together some of the roadmaps to develop an integrated vision. So we ended up developing 3 integrated visions for R&D and technology for strategy purpose. Next page, please. So to wrap up my case study introduction, throughout the project, what we observed were, in the first half of the sessions for week 1 to week 6, the first point was idea generation was successfully enhanced by carrying out individual work and teamwork. So it's recommended to do this if you can allocate time for this activity. Second point, 4 teams were formed only from week 5. So up to week 4, it was more like individual work. And the team worked throughout the project to the end from week 5. So we did individual work, but it was combined with teamwork, which worked quite well in terms of engagement and output performance. The third point, the SWOT confrontation is useful together with participants' discussions based on confidence level check. So we did the assessment in terms of impact, likelihood, importance, and performance, but we also discussed it visually, which of the options would be suitable for this company. So it was a useful approach. So bottom half, so in the last half of the sessions for week 7 to week 12, the first point, the same thing, but yes, overall direction building was done based on participants' discussion with confidence level check. The second point, with case analysis, it was really helpful that the company's executive provided the list of dimensions that are required from the senior management point of view for technology strategy development purposes. So it's recommended to get support from senior management throughout the project. Last point, before wrapping up the project, we included an extra step for all of the team members to have a look over the results to give feedback for brushing up purposes. And that was useful because it led to give some insights for the participants to finalize the vision integration towards the end as the final outcomes. So that is all from me to introduce a case study. I hope you get interested in the presentation. And now I pass on to Imoh for his case study introduction.
Right, thank you, Yuta, and very pleased to have the opportunity to share this case study. So this is a piece of work that I led last year, and I did it with colleagues, but very much basing it on SWOT. I mean, the road mapping work is based on SWOT. You will notice some similarities as I describe the process to what Yuta just described and what Rob described earlier, but I'll also try to draw out some differences. And there are always ways in which we can do road mapping slightly different from the last time to fit the context. So the context in this case was a healthcare challenge. So we had a company that primarily their reason for existence is to address a challenge that affects up to 70% of the global population. And this challenge cuts across different demographics. So in essence, they are a global company and they're operating in an industry that perhaps touches many of us, even right here on the call. So this organization, global healthcare company, they do R&D and they also do manufacturing. And in this case, there was a very noticeable trend of an increasing need for healthcare in this area. So things in terms of how we live our lives, the technology we use, but also increasing awareness of the condition as making it a growing market. So that's one of the things that really was one of the contextual factors for this piece of work. Very importantly as well, this company was repositioning itself, it was renewing its focus and goals, trying to make sure that it continued to deliver value to customers and rationalization of its business to do so. So a bit of a shakeup going on, which in a way fed into their need and eventual use of road mapping. And coupled with this is the strategic ambition they had, and they still do have to leapfrog their competitors and to take leadership positioning. So some quite ambitious targets So for example, in 5 years, they wanted to move up about 2 places, and in the next 2 years, move up another place or 2 to take a leadership position globally, right? So this was a company that really was intending to do with some really big things. So the challenge here was to focus and start with a product family that had huge growth potential, and to identify and map out areas for innovation. And these areas for innovation were to do with the products that they offer, but the service that comes along with it, but also their processes and the way they do their marketing and their strategic positioning overall. And while doing this, also to have organizational alignment, because they wanted not just the R&D to be on the front foot with regards to innovation, but they wanted the manufacturing and the commercial arms of the business to be in lockstep, so that everyone was going to be sort of proactive and facing the same direction of what they were doing. Given what they had in mind, we thought the SWOT road mapping approach will be a very good way to do things. Just a very quick reminder, Rob covered this earlier. The SWOT road mapping approach is based on S-Plan, and we have 2 levels of analysis in S-Plan. Typically, we've got the strategic landscape, I've got the topic road mapping. In between those 2, you've got the prioritization of initiatives. But essentially, this is S-Plan. And the reason I mention this is that I'm going to be showing a diagram that sort of depicts how we then broke this down to fit in the SWOT road mapping in a bit more detail. If you want some examples of what S-Plan looks like in reality, we have some reports on our website that you would be able to access and see what it looks like within the context of a report that's written. But back to the case study. So in this case, this work, and I think this is one of the ways in which it was different from previous case study, it was delivered remotely. Meaning I was here with my team in the UK, but we were delivering this work, and it involved people from right across the world. Remember, this is a global company. So we had people that were involved globally. The roadmap, development of the roadmap itself, the sort of the hands-on work to do it took about 12 weeks. And that was, again, because of the remote nature, we had to pace it out in a sensible way. Prior to that, however, there was quite a lot of scoping and planning, and this happens within any road mapping process. It's really important that you do this, whether you use SWOT road mapping or you do some other way. It's really important you have the planning process, and this is important for customization, making sure that the process actually works to the benefit of the need, or addressing the issues at hand. One of the key things we did in this was stakeholder analysis and understanding the value chain and the market in which the organization operates. And one of the ways this was important is that while there is a customer, while there's a user of the product, there are also people along that value chain, that buying decision, that influence the user, and we had to consciously bring them in terms of thinking about their own needs, bring them into the road mapping picture. So we had these healthcare professionals who would, in a way, they will prescribe the product to the patient or the eventual user. We also did market research to understand key customer and competitor trends, especially for an organization that wants to leapfrog competitors. You can see where the competitor analysis or understanding where they're headed themselves was important. So participation was about 25 people, middle and senior managers, cutting across strategy, market research, commercial, manufacturing, R&D globally. And this is where the cross-functional nature of road mapping also is important. And all that communication and alignment that Rob talked about earlier, you see the importance of it, especially when you're able to bring people from across your organization together to make decisions on strategy and initiatives. So breaking down the overall process, remember, this is based on S-Plan. S-Plan has 2 levels of analysis. We had the strategic landscaping to start with, and then we had the topic road mapping. All the planning had gone on before. We started with a kickoff webinar to ensure that all our participants were on the same page regarding the process, because sometimes it's good for them to see, people to see that, okay, there's a method to the madness, so to speak. There's a method, there's something we're trying to do here. There is a logical approach we're following, and you see the strands of SWOT in there. But one thing that we did, and perhaps this is again where it's different to the last case study, is that we led with visioning. Whereas in the last case study, the visions came out at the end. We started by constructing a vision, which was really important for an organization that is sort of rationalizing, trying to reposition itself. We needed to have a clear direction as to where we want to go. And this visioning was in a way derived from a higher level vision that the broad organization had, but we had to distill it down to the product family that we were road mapping for. So when we do visioning, we involve different stakeholder groups so that they're all aligned again, and they agree, and they think, yeah, this is what definitely we should be doing. This visioning step is also a key aspect of answering one of the key important questions we ask ourselves when we're doing road mapping, which is, where do we want to go? All right, so this was important for that reason. But again, for another reason, which I'll explain in a moment, with regards to SWOT, which Rob touched on, it is very important as much as possible to have a clear vision. So we went through the strategic landscaping. We did the why layer, understanding the external trends and drivers, and drawing from those opportunities and threats, and the key ones. And then we also went into the how layer to picture what necessary capabilities and resources were, and drawing from those the strengths and weaknesses, and then doing the SWOT analysis, and then going on to identify key initiatives and doing the topic road mapping for those. Diagrammatically, that looks a bit like this. So imagine the roadmap framework. You have the vision on the right-hand side. When we do visioning, we usually would at least do visioning to reflect 3 perspectives. There's a market perspective, the innovation perspective, and the capability perspective to your vision. And this in a way aligns already with the roadmap framework of the why, the what, and the how. Now, the market perspective of vision is basically how do you want the world to see you? How do you want to be positioned alongside your competitors and so on? How do you want your customers to see you in the market? Okay, so for example, we want to be seen as #1 and so on and so forth. But what is the innovation that would underpin that? And that's moving to the next layer down in the innovation perspective. So now you're thinking, actually, how are we going to become #1? What's our vision for our products, right, and our services? And then again, what's our vision for our capabilities? All right, and in this way, you step away from having a single statement or vision statement to having a set of statements that properly explain what you want to be. And that really does drive action. Now, having the vision is really important for context, because when you start thinking of your trends and drivers, which would, in this case, included macro trends and drivers, customer needs, both the final customer and all the people along the value chain, the challenges they had, the competitors, and so on. All of that information, in a way, is neutral information until you place it in the context of your vision, what you want to be. And from that, you can start identifying opportunities and threats, right? So we got the opportunities and threats through this process. The most critical ones we focused on. Similarly, when we did the how layer, we understood, okay, what are the capabilities we have now and the things that we think we will need for the future to meet our vision. But comparing it to what we have right now, where are strengths and weaknesses? And so we're able to derive opportunities and threats, strengths and weaknesses, and combining those, we started identifying some initiatives. Some of those initiatives were new product service ideas, and some of them were market innovation ideas as well. But alongside all of that, we're also able to identify what we call strategic enablers. For example, the improvement of cross-business unit collaboration, because if they were able to do that, they will be able to hit some real targets and do some really innovative things through knowledge sharing. So you have not only new ideas, innovation-wise, but also you're trying to, or from this process, we're able to strengthen some of the things that otherwise would have been weaknesses and make them strategic enablers to bring those new product innovation and service innovation ideas to life. So in short, the outcomes from this process were as follows: having a three-tiered vision for the product family. And that vision, remember, provided a context to identify the SWOT components and identify which ones were the most critical ones. We were able, via the SWOT analysis, to identify 12 distinct new product service ideas, right? Some of these were confirmation of things we already knew or that were already in the heads of the participants coming into the workshop. But 3 of them were completely new and you could say attributable entirely to the SWOT component of the process. And this is where the value add comes in. Along with all the conversations that we would have during the workshop, this was actually what we could see that, yeah, by bringing SWOT into it, there were some new ideas that perhaps we wouldn't have thought of. Along with these innovation ideas were the strategic enablers I talked about earlier. And all of this led to 8 priority ideas that we created roadmaps for. So we had 8 individual topic roadmaps, and eventually we summarized all of these to show the progression between those 8 and how you move from where you are now into the future based on those 8 ideas, innovation ideas. So my final slide here is just to say, in terms of learnings, SWOT-based road mapping was useful, and in this case, successful, because number one, SWOT is familiar to many people. In planning for this process, in fact, one of the senior managers asked, are we going to do some SWOT analysis? And he said, yeah, absolutely, we're going to do SWOT analysis. People know SWOT. If you bring it into your analysis, it's likely to be accepted, as it was in this case. And where there's acceptance and buy-in into your process, then it is easier to run that process. And ultimately, if people buy into it, then whatever the results are, people are more likely to buy into as well. If people buy into the results of your planning process, then it's more likely that those results will be implemented. Okay, so there is a very good causality chain here for good practice. And then value add, improved results. We could see visioning, we could see ideation, and I demonstrated that in the previous slide. But SWOT also fulfills a fundamental role in road mapping's purpose. Many people regard road mapping as a risk management tool or an uncertainty management tool. It's a good process for making sense of your future. So it's a good sense-making tool. And SWOT, in a way, strengthens that by bringing to light and making explicit things that should be considered as part of your strategy. So I'm going to stop here. At this point, I would say we can open things up for questions. Thank you so much for listening. And I recognize that we have some questions in Q&A part of this screen here. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Rob Driver, to manage that session. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Imoh, and thanks for all of the presenters today for those really insightful presentations. Please start or continue to put your questions into the Q&A section. Imoh, if you could stop sharing your screen so that we could see everybody's faces, that would be fantastic. just wanted to start by kind of looking, and this is a question I think for Rob Phaal. You mentioned the toolkit platform, and obviously kind of SWOT road mapping, strengthening SWOT the analysis, strengthening the road mapping approach Imoh just touched on. The wider toolkit platform that you mentioned in your earlier presentation, if you could expand on that, that'd be really useful, I think.
Sure. As an engineer, I'm kind of fascinated by tools of all sorts, and management tools and frameworks have been a long-term interest. And really concerning is there's a proliferation of tools, very active consulting and academic community, always creating new tools, and it's really confusing. So we've been always wondering, how do you combine tools in an effective, coherent way to solve particular problems? And it's often quite challenging. What we found with road mapping is a particularly interesting tool because it's got a very powerful integrating function. And so in general, you can always relate any information, strategic information, into that structure, but also you can understand other tools better because they serve a function within that landscape, if you like, that's defined by the roadmap. And so we've got quite a bit of experience on combining individual tools with roadmaps. And every tool has strengths and weaknesses, including road mapping. Road mapping is very good for communication and integration, but it's pretty weak analytically. So we've always found it necessary to combine it with other tools, and two in particular. So we need to understand dependencies in the system, and matrices are the best way to map dependencies in any system. And then we have to make choices, and the sort of 2x2 matrix is a very good prioritization decision-making tool. So that's why we've got those three tools. We understand them in their general format, and we can configure them for, I believe, any situation, because over the years, that's what we've been trying to do, is expose these ideas to as much variety as possible. So we have a pretty high degree of confidence and about that. And so that's this is another example of that. But as I said, the integration is a little bit more deeper than many other tools, which you kind of bolt on, you loop out, you resolve a question, and come back to the roadmap. In here, it basically went into the heart of the method because that's what SWOT does.
Fantastic, thank you, Rob. So just starting on the questions that have come in via the chat. Firstly, Rob, you've indicated you wanted to answer the first one, which is, what is the difference with a confrontation matrix?
Yes, so that leads on well from that previous point, really, that it's really important in any system to understand critical dependencies, and both in both directions. You may have one element affecting another, or vice versa. And the absolute best way is to map them into matrices like this. And there are many, they're not really an identified class of tool. We call them interlinking grids, really, because you can actually have a whole set of these that connect together. That is effectively a knowledge graph of all of the elements and the dependencies in the system. You'll find examples or instances of this general class of tool. They're usually quite technical. If everyone's familiar with quality function deployment, or the design structure matrix, or Ocean Canny X matrix, these are all just examples of matrices that are about dependencies. And in this case, again, the terminology is not standard, but these are confrontational matrices linking opportunities, threats, strengths, and weaknesses are just another instance of that. And if we put them, as shown in these schematics, as opportunities and threats against strengths and weaknesses, you can just very systematically start to map in which strengths are related to which opportunities and threats, which weaknesses, and so on. And basically, in a road mapping terms, those are connected through the middle layer. They're connecting the top and the bottom layer through something in the middle. And that's what we're trying to find, that something. So once we've filled in these matrices, you can then sort of have these interesting conversations about what exactly could we do that can leverage the strength to address this opportunity or strength. threat. And what's really nice about it is it gives a really balanced view. So you get not just the, I think there's a human bias toward the optimism. And so you don't just get the positive or offensive options, as they call, you get the defensive options. You get strengthening options as well as survival options. So you get a much more balanced set of options by doing it systematically using this simple matrix tool.
Thank you, Rob. Next question. Thank you to Onkar Joshi. Let's just hold on a sec. How can small companies and startups use this approach, or is it relevant to them? Who'd like to answer that?
I'll be happy to answer that. So for smaller companies, we have done road mapping. We did, in fact, a lot of road mapping for smaller companies under a certain ARDF program some years ago. But what we have found out is that, and this is where the customization is important, the process you follow for a larger organization might not necessarily be the same one you'd follow for a smaller one. The fundamentals of the process will be the same, but you can strip it down in such a way that it's not too overbearing for that smaller organization. The principles of strategy are the same, of road mapping are the same across board. The structure of the roadmap overall, having the key layers in there will more or less be the same as well. It's just if you like, the level depth of analysis, the weight of the analysis might be somewhat different. But remember that the reference process here, the S-plan process, it's workshop based and it's meant to take 1 day. Of course, you do some planning beforehand and you probably do a bit more work afterwards. But 1 day for strategy, key people from your team, you don't need 30 people all the time. It could be the 4 or 5 of you within the company, which we have done. It works, and this is something that you can bring into your organization as well. So I think my answer to your question is that yes, it will work. You may just need to strip it down a bit, and we'll be happy to discuss that with you in a bit more detail if you want to get in touch.
And I would like to add my point as well here. So thank you very much for the question. So can startup use this approach? Yes, why not? I think it can be applied to startup strategy development, as Imoh just explained. I think you can even implement your own, I think, but depends on the scope and aim and what you expect for the output. So it depends on that. You might want to involve some other stakeholders, such as your partner companies or supporting organizations or investors. The focus is on capturing opportunity, threat, strengths and weaknesses with timeline to develop strategy by using road mapping. So startups, yes, I think we can use the approach.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Yuta and Imoh. Just moving on to the next question from Lisa Pace. Thank you for this. I'm wondering whether and how the approach can be used and adapted for use in the context of value chains. So does someone want to touch on this?
Yes, I think the question is for me. So yeah, thank you so much for your question. Yes, it's very important to define the scope and aim before starting road mapping. So my case study was about one company looking into technology strategy in the logistics and transportation industry. But if the scope is value chains, then yes, you can define your focus is value chain and use the approach.
Thank you, Yuta. On to the next question from Wajahat Nassar. How were changing factors incorporated over the weeks, 1 week to the next? And Yuta, I think you've indicated again you'd like to answer that.
Okay, thank you again for your question. Yes, project was carried out on a working group basis rather than workshop basis. So we used a cloud data storage service that we all have access to. And then we provided work to do and set deadline for submission every week. And then for the 2-hour session, we meet face to face. We review them and discuss the next steps. So that's how we did like a cyclic working group basis approach.
Yuta. The next question is from Mario. What would be an example of layer 1 market-based roadmap and layer 2 being about the system? Who'd like to answer that?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'll attempt it. So an example of a market-based roadmap, the first layer of a roadmap, or the top layer, usually we would have information that would relate to the market if your roadmap, say, were to be for innovation of products and services. So having a market-based roadmap essentially means that you start with that information and then you build the rest of the roadmap based on what you perceive as the needs of the market, of your customers, and perhaps in reaction to what your competitors are doing. But to build on that, usually you go to the next layer, and that's perhaps where you start talking about the system that you need to innovate or that you want to innovate around. So it's not as though you have a different roadmap for one layer and another one for another layer. Your roadmap in the end usually is an integration and alignment of different perspectives that are represented over these different layers. So market-based roadmap, yes, start with the market layer information, and then you work your way downwards, including the system aspect that you need to innovate in or for. I hope that sort of makes sense.
Thank you, Imoh. And I think we've probably got time just for one more question, and then we'll just got to round off with a few slides about how to engage with the IfM and IfM Engage as well. So the next one just from Junwoo. I'm wondering if it's correct to derive a strategy from the first case study and then formulate a vision based on that strategy. Since the vision represents the future, wouldn't it be more appropriate to first establish the vision and then develop the strategies to achieve it? Who'd like to take that one on? Oh, we'll hear from Yuta and Rob on this.
Yuta first.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your question. Yes, yeah, right. So in a case study I explained, each team developed vision first and then develop strategy to achieve. Yeah, that's how we did. I didn't mention, but when the participants worked on mapping and overall directions in the first half of the project, that's where visions were constructed. So we have visions first, and the strategies were developed through case and roadmap development in the last half of sessions of the project. So at the end, we were just trying to see if we could develop integrated vision as a whole, rather than just listing individual visions. Yeah.
So my only addition to that is, in general, I think both of those options and other options are possible, and I've seen them. It depends on the context. So in general, though, I'd say that if strategy is rather incremental, it may be easier to start on the left and see where that goes and then clarify the vision. If it's more transformative change, often people will want to start on the right-hand side and establish desirable or undesirable future states and then work towards them, or a combination of those.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for all those answers. I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to get round to answering all the questions in the chat, but if you do have any specific questions, we'll provide contact details in this and be sending out an email to be able to contact us if you do have any questions. I just wanted to cover quickly how to engage with the IfM and IfM Engage if you're interested in finding out more about road mapping and SWOT road mapping. Firstly, we have 2 upcoming courses, Strategic Road Mapping, which is an in-person course in Cambridge. Please come and visit Cambridge, it's a lovely place, on the 10th and the 11th of October 2023. And then we also have a Product and Technology Road Mapping course, which starts on the 25th of September, and that is online. We deliver consultancy and training projects to support organisations that are interested in road mapping. We've got a range of case studies that are available on the IfM Engage website that talk about ways that we have implemented road mapping to support organisations. We'll send through links about those so you can look at your convenience. We also have some additional resources that you can access on the website too. So we've got a short guide that gives an introduction to strategic and technology roadmaps, and we also have a video which is a general overview of road mapping and what it can do for organisations. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about the STEM Consortium. We've got a network meeting coming up on the 22nd and 23rd of November. The STEM Consortium is a member network of organisations and researchers looking to develop best practice solutions to innovation and technology management challenges. As I said, we've got an ex-member meeting on the 22nd and 23rd of November, but we also have like taster sessions for organisations that are potentially interested in joining. So if you are interested, please respond to the email that you'll receive after this session and get in contact to potentially reserve your place. So that draws this presentation to a close. I'd just like to thank everyone in the audience for taking the time to attend. It's been really useful to have you here. And also, obviously, a big thank you to Rob, Imoh and Yuta for putting their time in putting this presentation together. And I hope you've really enjoyed it and found it valuable. So have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Bye.